This is the Reason interview with Nick Gillespie. I'm Billy Binion, guest hosting for Nick. Our guest this week is Christina Dent, whose organization, End It for Good, seeks to change the approach to addiction from a criminal justice issue to a health-centered one. But Dent is not your typical anti-drug war activist. She's an evangelical Christian who believes legalizing drugs is the conservative thing to do, a position she adopted after an encounter she had as a foster mom. Dent and I talked about her conservative religious upbringing, the surprising history of the war on drugs, how the current approach to substance abuse fuels crime, misconceptions about people struggling with addiction, and why prohibition is actually a progressive response. She has also offered to send a copy of her recent memoir, Curious, free of charge to anyone interested in learning more, which you can request at curious@enditforgood.com. And now to the Reason interview with Christina Dent. Christina Dent, thank you for talking to Reason.
Thanks, Billy. It's really great to be here.
Okay, so I want to start with the low-hanging fruit. You are an evangelical Christian.
Yep.
You are conservative in both your politics and in your theology.
Yep.
You believe the Bible is the inerrant word of God. Why is ending the drug war your issue of choice then?
Yeah, that was a winding journey. Not something I ever thought I would be working on, for sure. I was born and raised in Mississippi. I've lived here my whole life. And all of those things are true. And as part of that, the culture I grew up in was in the 80s and 90s. Very much kind of tough on drugs, tough on crime. That all sounded great to me. I could not fathom a world where somebody wouldn't want that. I just couldn't even put that in my mind. And part of that culture was this view of people who use drugs that was they are bad people doing bad things. And if that drug use became an addiction, that was sort of another level of moral degradation. And I don't remember anybody specifically saying that. It was just the kind of cultural winds that were part of the world and the US, and specifically kind of the cultures that I grew up in during that time. And so for me, that journey was one first of my own heart beginning to change through becoming a foster parent, getting closer to the issue, and then my mind beginning to change over the course of a learning journey where I really tried to kind of take it down to the studs and say, what is happening? What's really causing harm related to drugs, and how could we get better outcomes?
So you mentioned your upbringing briefly. Can you just kind of walk us through what that was like? So you live in Mississippi. You've lived there your whole life. Your parents were both, your dad was in ministry?
He went to seminary, but it was to work at a Christian school. So he was really passionate about Christian education and ended up getting a double master's degree in Old Testament theology and Christian education, and did work at a Christian school his whole career.
So then what was that upbringing like? You guys were, in your memoir, you talk about being very involved in your church, right? And it was very much this kind of tight-knit Christian community.
Yes, very much so. A very warm and wonderful place to grow up. My mom homeschooled me and my brothers all the way through kindergarten through high school, just because she wanted to be with us. So it was not part of a sort of anti-public school movement. It just was, she didn't want us gone that long in the day. She thought, that's just too long. I want to be with my kids. And so she wanted to homeschool us, and we ended up doing that all the way through. The church community I grew up in was wonderful. Had lots of people who mentored me, who poured into me. So I didn't feel I was sheltered from a lot of kind of the outside pain, and I did not have addiction close to me. I did grow up in a higher crime part of Jackson, grew up in West Jackson. And so that was on my mind, but it was not, it wasn't something that I felt personally, that kind of sense of, I think because addiction didn't come close to me. And so I was always able to kind of otherize people who were struggling. Like they're somebody else. They're not people that I know or people that I love, in a way that brought me kind of face to face with the way that I was thinking and what does that mean for people who I know and love.
And then you became a foster mom.
Yes.
So then that changed the circumstances that you just described, right? You were face to face with someone you really learned to care about and respect who was dealing with addiction. Tell me about that.
Yeah. So my husband and I became foster parents in our early 30s. We had 2 sons already by that point. I had never had a dream of becoming a foster parent at all. It sounded really messy to me. It sounded very local. I was interested in adoption, but always thought of that as the other side of the world, kind of taking a child and bringing them far away from all of the pain that they had been through and giving them a fresh start. But through a variety of circumstances, we ended up as foster parents. And that experience brought me to a phone call one afternoon in December in 2015. And that was asking us if we would take another child. We already had one foster son at that point who was a toddler. And this was for a newborn coming straight from the hospital. His mom had been using drugs while she was pregnant. And so he was removed from her custody and put in foster care. And we had said no, 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 no to all of the requests in the 18 months since we had taken our first foster son. I was homeschooling my own kids. I was totally exhausted.
Right.
But this one, really for my husband and I, our faith is really important to us. And he just called me and said, I got another call. I just think that God wants us to say yes to this. And, I thought, well, that's easy for you to say from your office. You're gone 40 hours a week while I'm home raising the kids and homeschooling and trying to survive. But we did say yes. And so Beckham came to our house that afternoon, just a couple hours after that phone call. And he was a preemies. He was just 5 pounds, 9 ounces when he arrived. And I didn't know any other way to think about addiction other than what I had picked up from the culture, which is bad people doing bad things. So I could not fathom a mom who was using drugs while she was pregnant. Like, how could that exist
Right.
in the same person as a mom who loves her child? I didn't have a category for that. And so I assumed that this was a mom who didn't love her child, didn't have his best interests at heart. But I met her a couple of days later. I went to his first visit at our local child welfare center, and I pulled into the parking lot, popped his car seat out of my van, turned around to walk in, and here comes this woman running across the parking lot towards me. And she's crying and literally running to meet us. And she runs over and just starts talking to and kissing this baby who is in this car seat that I'm awkwardly holding. Was not expecting this at all. And I honestly, Billy, I really felt suspicious about it. I did
you
not
think she was kind of putting on an act?
Yeah. I just thought, oh gosh, this is, for one, it was such a raw display of kind of vulnerable affection that it really caught me off guard. And it felt like, gosh, I don't even know if I would be, I don't know. It just felt so like unreserved and just kind of like, whoa, this is.
Right. Because this woman is a stranger to you.
Yes. And so, I thought, I don't know, this is probably not real. This is like trying to get me to put in a good word with the social worker situation. But I knew when he came, I knew that the social worker had told me his mom really wants to regain custody. She really wants to be there for him. But, is that true or not? I don't know. And it's easier if it's not true. It's easier if I can sort of put her in a bucket and move on. And so she got to spend her 1 hour with him. I came back to pick him up, and I will never forget the image in my mind of walking into that child welfare office visitation room. It was tiny. I don't know, probably like 8 feet by 10 feet, maybe. The couch that she was sitting on took up the entire wall. It was just this tiny little space. And she's sitting in the corner of the couch, and Beckham is sleeping up on her shoulder. And she's just sitting, doing nothing other than just drinking him in. She's not on her phone. She's just sitting there with her eyes closed, just enjoying this 1 hour that she gets to spend with him. Because he came home to our house after that, and she left for inpatient drug treatment a couple of hours away. But she would still call me. I'd given her my phone number. She would call me once a day. They let her make 1 phone call a day to get an update on him. She wanted to know everything I could tell her about him. And then she would ask me to put her on speakerphone, and she would sing to him over the phone. I can be standing in my kitchen listening to her singing to him while he's sitting in this little bouncy seat by my feet. And over time, I realized this is real. This is true. This is who she really is, which means that I've radically misunderstood something about what's going on with addiction, because I could not shut my eyes to the truth that this is a mom like me. She really does love her son just as much as I love my sons. And she really does want to be there for him, which means this 20-year drug problem that she has been dealing with is something other than this kind of moral situation,
Right.
because she was a bad person that I had thought. And that started my learning journey.
So what was next for you then? So you meet Joanne. She eventually gets Beckham back, correct?
Yes, she does. And he actually was not with us for very long. It was, she had found a drug treatment place that was very supportive of mom-child relationships, and they allowed children up to the age of 5 to be there. They provided childcare for them during the day and classes and everything for the parents. And so he went back to be with her only about a month after he came to us, but it was a really life-changing month for me. So yeah, he was only with us for a short time, but as soon as he went back, I just could not shut my eyes to that. And I started trying to learn. I started reading books and talking with people and trying to kind of figure out, how far does this unwind?
Right.
Where does this thread go if I follow it to the place where I find what really is true about the causes of addiction? And that led me, as I started looking into that led me into this bigger picture of what we're doing with drugs, drug
Right.
markets, overdose,
Right.
crime, cartels, that whole thing.
Well, and that was why I was going to ask, because Joanne, she was never arrested, or like in your experience with her, she was never jailed, correct?
Yes.
So
Correct.
how did you go from, okay, I've misunderstood kind of addiction as a moral issue to a policy one? I know that's a big question, but I'm curious how that leap was made.
Yeah. So it began with learning about what causes addiction.
Mm.
The most impactful part of that to me, because I'm not a policy researcher or anything like that. But I came across this story about a researcher called Dr. Bruce Alexander. He did an experiment that he called Rat Park. This was done, 50 years ago, but it was back when we were seeing these videos of rats in cages, and look what happens if you give them, cocaine or heroin. They just use it until they die. And I remember seeing that as a kid. I don't know where I would have seen that, because my parents were very careful about what we watched, but I remember seeing the rats in the cages, and this is kind of drug education about what not to do. And so he looked at that and he said, wait a second, you're putting one rat solitary in a cage with nothing to do other than drink this drug-laced water. I wonder what would happen if we put rats in cages that they actually wanted to be in, where they
Right.
had things to do and they had
Could
friends and
make
kind of,
friendships? Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, so they built what they called Rat Park. And they gave the rats the ability to drink the drug laced water if they wanted to. And what they found is the rats almost never chose the drug laced water. When they were happy, they didn't have any reason to want to change the way that they felt. And even if they used it, it never became compulsive. They used it, what you might call, recreationally for the rats, just every now and then. And so he began this journey that many other people have picked up along the way of shifting the focus from the drug to the context of a person's life and what makes them susceptible to a particular drug becoming a problem for them, because most people who use drugs don't become addicted to them. So it isn't the drug that creates the risk. People develop risk based on other things, based particularly on the level of pain and suffering, whether that's physical or mental, emotional, whatever it might be that's in their life. And so if we want to address addiction, if we want to help people not become addicted or to find recovery, focusing on the drug will get us nowhere, because that's not the issue. That's the coping mechanism for what is actually the issue. And as I learned about that, that really broke my heart, because arresting people and incarcerating them is meant to increase pain and suffering in their life.
Right.
But it's built on this idea that if people are bad, they need to be punished. And if you punish them, then they will stop being bad, kind of like spanking a child. It's sort of this adult spanking. We just have to spank them, just arrest them, give them some pain, and that will fix it. And it's actually the opposite. People need to find healing, not more pain, to be able to make changes in their life. And that for me was the first kind of policy shift of, wait a second, I don't think we should be arresting people just because they're in possession of a drug. It did not change my mind about should we arrest people for theft or something like that.
Right.
That's a different thing. But just for possessing a drug, that I could not make sense of that anymore if the goal was to actually help fewer people be using drugs.
Right. So what I'm hearing is essentially you were finding that a lot of people turn to drugs to deal with trauma in your research. I know you yourself have dealt with some trauma. Didn't both of your parents die like in quick succession fairly young? And so I'm wondering, do you ever encounter people who are like, well, I have been through traumatic things, you've been through traumatic things, everyone carries kind of their burdens, but I didn't turn to that.
Yes.
Is that a response you hear often? And what is your response to that? Because, as I said, your parents both died when you were in your early 20s, and it was like one right after the other, correct? I mean, that's like when I read your book, that was a horrible weight, I feel like, for any young person to bear. What is your response to that kind of more, I guess, kind of, well, I didn't have to turn to drugs to get over it. I was able to pull myself up.
Yeah. So I think you're right. So my mom passed away when I was 19, my dad when I was 23, both of cancer after being incredibly healthy people. We grew up with like my mom making whole wheat bread from scratch.
Right. It sounds like just a horrible deck of cards to draw.
Yes. And so, I look at that and I say, I was not someone who was interested in substance use. If I had been, could I have become susceptible to that? Absolutely.
Right.
Because I have coping mechanisms in my life that I go to that are unhealthy. It just doesn't happen to be heroin or cocaine, but it could be because there are times where that pain feels like too much to bear. So I think the temptation to flatten our experiences is something we really have to push against. And just because I experienced one thing doesn't mean someone else is going to experience it that way.
Right.
I have a friend who's a therapist, and he said, sometimes you'll be talking to two people who are kind of dealing with the similar things. And for one of them, it is like getting hit by a bus and killed, like they're barely hanging on. And for the other one, it's like, a little bicycle wreck and they walk away with a scratch. The complexity of how we experience the experiences of our life and then how we move on from those or how we pursue healing within those is so incredibly unique. So for me, particularly as a person of faith, to me, this makes sense. We're all really unique. We're all formed as individuals, and there would be no reason to think that we respond like robots, where everyone has the exact same response to the same things that happen in their life. And people are able to, you see it in addiction recovery also. Some recovery pathways work for some people and they don't at all for others. It is crazy to me that we have that same flattening in the recovery world where we say, if this was the pathway I used to recover, this is the pathway that should work for everyone.
Right.
There's just no other thing that we deal with that we say, what worked for me worked for you.
Right,
yes.
yeah.
If I had any other kind of health malady, we wouldn't say, well, you shouldn't try any other medication than the one that worked for me. We automatically know, well, wait a second, people's body chemistry is different. There's so many variables that could impact that. And I think that's true of whatever causes there are for addiction. I know a lot of parents, especially who have children who've struggled, feel a lot of guilt over, was it my parenting? Did I hurt them in some way? Did I cause whatever is this root cause? To me, that is a futile path to walk down because, I was a couple of years ago, my brothers and I were sitting around at Christmas talking about our childhood. And we all had a great childhood. And one of my brothers and I were talking about how, in our house, no pun intended, reason was valued very highly over emotion. And so if I wanted my brothers to stop teasing me, I had to make this kind of rational argument to my parents of why they should make them stop teasing me. Not just, I hate it and it makes me angry and just tell them to stop. And so he and I are agreeing, yes, this is rational thought and rational arguments for what was valued. Emotion really couldn't be used as an argument. And my other brother is sitting there and he's listening and he says, I have no idea what you're talking about. Like, I don't know. Maybe I was like out in my shop working on some projects and we're thinking, what? This is like this is how our family operated. This was not one random afternoon while you were in your
Right.
shop. So you have these kids. We're very close in age. Me and my 3 brothers are all within 5 years, like top to bottom. We were all homeschooled. We spent a ton of time together at home, experiencing the same family, experiencing the same upbringing. And yet we have very different perspectives of
Right.
how we experienced our parents and the culture of our home. That's just the human experience. And uh, I want for us to value the fact that everyone's experiences are different. Everyone has different support systems. Everyone has different ways that they process the pain and the suffering in their life that happens at different times. It doesn't have to be that they had a traumatic childhood.
Right.
I was talking to a guy who said, I moved to a new city and I didn't have any friends. And suddenly, my recreational substance use became very problematic. And I started struggling with a heroin addiction. But he could make draw that clear line to, I know
Sure.
what caused this. I got into a situation in which I was really lonely and isolated, and this became the coping mechanism. So
Right. So you're saying it's not always fitting into a box of what people would really consider trauma, quote unquote.
Yes.
Right.
Yep. There's so many causes.
So you're still in a very conservative environment. And historically, this is not a group that is necessarily down with legalizing drugs. So what information do you think a lot of these people are missing? Because I know that, in your memoir, it's not as if you're making the argument that they have bad intentions. So what do you think, what pieces of the puzzle do you think that, a conservative, who really wants to bring the hammer down, apart from the fact that there's often an understandable reason, a reason we can empathize with for why someone might start using drugs. What information do you think these people are missing for why the solution of bringing the hammer down doesn't always work?
Yeah, that's why I think it's super important to carry on the argument past drug possession, because the vast majority of the harm that the rest of us experience who are not using drugs is actually coming from the market harms from criminalizing drugs. So the amount of crime that we experience, the amount of people that are dying from overdose from contaminated drugs, those won't be addressed just because we don't arrest people for drug possession. You have to go further than that and look at drug markets. So for me, as I was learning, I had a very specific experience before this of someone asking me, what do you think about legalizing drugs? And this was also someone who was a Christian and conservative. And my blood pressure just went through the roof. Like, I couldn't even imagine that this
So you were like, how could they even be considering this?
Like, yes, even asking the question is just insanity. This is so crazy. So I say that to say I was not someone who was sort of ambivalent about it and then sort of said, oh, yeah, I'll kind of move towards this. I thought it was absolutely insane. But I thought it was absolutely insane because I did not understand just the basics of underground markets and the economics of prohibition. And that's something that you could explain in about 10 minutes, but I had never understood that. I'd never encountered that. I have a degree in Bible. I didn't take economics or anything like that. And most people in my experience, we've, as an organization, End It For Good, the organization that I started and work for today, we've hosted 40 events now where we give this kind of from the ground up presentation on, we assume people don't know anything other than what they've kind of picked up culturally. And we kind of take them from 0 to 60 in 20 minutes, kind of addressing the consumer harm, the market harm from criminalizing markets, and what happens to substances and contamination through criminalization. And learning about pushing markets underground, and that just gives that market to criminal enterprises, and that
Right.
increases, it incentivizes crime and violence. I had never thought about that, never made that connection. And in my experience with the 2,000 people that have come to the events that we host, most of them have not thought about it either. Not because they are, it's just information that has not crossed their path. So if it has crossed your path, it begins to seem like surely all of the world knows this. It's curse of knowledge sort of thing. And you feel like, it gets harder and harder to remember what it was like before you knew this information. And yet most of America is out there and they have not thought about that before.
Right.
And so for a lot of conservative people, I would say this was certainly true for me. The issue of drugs resides in a moral category in our minds, not in a pragmatic category. So there was for me, this kind of realizing that that was the case. I had never really thought about it that way before. But as I began to learn about the pragmatic harms, I began to be concerned that the moral weight actually rests on the other side. That criminalizing was causing a lot more loss of life, destruction of families. And I started running that through my conservative values. So I want strong families. Drug criminalization destroys families. I want people's lives to be valued. I believe they're made in the image of God. Criminalizing drugs causes all kinds of people to be killed in violence as well as overdose. That's preventable if the markets were regulated.
And that's because of harm reduction. Like the supply is getting contaminated because no one has any quality control over what's in it.
Yes. Yep. No quality control. So you can sell whatever you want to whoever you want. There's no age restrictions.
Right.
And you can put fentanyl in it, and the market will incentivize that because if you can get your package smaller, then you have less
more
risk
addictive
of detection.
Right.
So you have this iron law of prohibition. And then I, started thinking beyond. What about employment? That's a big value for conservatives. We want people able to work and provide for themselves. Well, here in Mississippi, 1 in 10 adults has a felony on their record. That is crazy.
A lot of people.
That is a lot of people. That is a lot of people. 1 in 4 has a criminal conviction of some kind. So when you think of it just on a workforce perspective, how many people are not working because we have saddled them with something that they have paid their debt to society. If they're out in the world, they're not in prison if they spent time in prison anymore. And yet they can't move beyond it because who is going to hire someone? There's very few places where they can get a job that's actually going to provide for them if they have a felony. So, of course, not all of those are drug related, but we know that a drug arrest is the easiest way for people to find their way into the criminal justice system because about 13% of Mississippi adults use illegal drugs. So you've got a 1 in 10 shot of being able to catch someone who has is using. So I just started working this through, and it became clear to me that the values that I thought supported criminalization, I absolutely believe they actually support legalization. That's not to say I don't have fears about legalization. I think it can be done poorly. I think there is risk there of how it's done, of making sure that social norms develop alongside of those legalized markets so that we can minimize the potential for harm there. But if you look at the harms that this is a good example. There's a dad who lost his son to an overdose. And he told me, if we look at all of our biggest fears related to drugs, what are they? Well, people become addicted. People are going to die. Families are going to be destroyed. All of those fears are made worse by criminalization. We're living with those fears today. We're living with the outcome of those. That's happening today in the world of prohibition and criminalization. We have an opportunity to shift away from that to something where the markets are regulated, where the consumers are going to know what they're getting. We have a way to put age restrictions on access. We can have quality control. And if someone is using or is struggling with an addiction and they need help, they're able to get the right kind of help instead of just perpetuating trauma and harm. So for him, that was a big learning curve. He's a former police officer. He used to really just love doing drug busts, this father, because he thought, I'm making the streets safer and I'm and now after losing his son and going on his own learning journey, realized wow, this is not what I thought it was. And if we want better outcomes, we have to look at what's actually causing the harm. So I got there on a kind of pragmatic front of just beginning to try to put the fear on the shelf. That fear, one of the things I learned in foster parent training is when we are afraid, we cannot think. You can't think and you can't learn when you're afraid. And what have we been told about drugs for 50 years? It's just to be afraid.
To be afraid.
To be afraid, which means don't think, don't learn, just feel afraid. And if we can put that fear on the shelf for a little bit and start just learning, thinking through, you do not have to be a policy expert to understand what happens when you force a $500 billion a year market into the underground. It's going to create a whole lot of people who are fighting over that money. And that's going to play out in communities across the world.
Right. I'm curious about that police officer's son. When he was still, is he still a law enforcement officer?
No, he's not.
So when he was active, did he know his son was struggling? And what was that like for him?
So he was not active at the point that his son was struggling, but he remembers all of his interactions with his son were also based out of the same way that I grew up, that
Right.
This is a behavior problem. This is, his son just needed to get his act together. Lots of yelling, lots of threatening, lots of trying to use fear to get his son to stop using. And I know that he would give anything to take that back and to be able to approach his son in a way that is supportive and understanding of whatever it was that was underneath that struggle. But he realizes now this is not the way that he responded was not the way that would help his son get help, no matter how frustrating it was to him. That his son was much more frustrated with his own addiction, much more. He already felt like a failure. He didn't need anybody else to tell him that. And I've encountered parent after parent after parent who has had a similar experience of wishing that they could go back after losing a child and have that time back again, to come alongside them and say, I love you no matter what. I support you no matter what. I don't support the decisions that you're making right now. And I might have to put up some boundaries because addiction can be really chaotic. But I'm always here for you, and I love you, and I want to be here as a support for you. Because that same dad told me, if everyone had to realize what the true risk is, the risk isn't just that your kid keeps using drugs. The risk is they're gone.
Right.
That they're dead, and there is no hope then for recovery. There's no hope for any other kind of future. Suddenly, some of these solutions that seem crazy start to look really good. If this could help my child have stayed alive, if this could have given him a few more years to find that pathway of recovery. And so I think a lot of us are hopeful that we can strong arm our way through addiction or get our loved one to, by kind of strong arm them through it and out of it before anything bad happens. And with 100,000 people dying every year right now of overdose, there are lots and lots of families who are realizing that the opportunity is now gone and are becoming open to what could have actually helped, what could have, not what feels good. What feels good and what actually does good are often very different things. And this is very true in this on this issue.
What do you think works best?
So
you're saying when you say
world,
feels good, you mean like the discipline, right?
Yes.
Right. And so then what works, rather?
Yeah. So there are a couple of things that can help families. So if someone is listening now and they have a family member who's struggling, really encourage you to check out what's called CRAFT. It's Community Reinforcement and Family Training. You can find CRAFT groups in different parts of the country. You can also find it online. Allies for Recovery does online trainings and support in the craft method. It teaches family members not just how to sit on the sidelines and kind of disconnect from the chaos. It teaches them how to connect with their loved one in a way that has been studied and proven to increase their loved one's likelihood of getting help for their addiction. So there are other kind of mutual aid groups for family members like Al-Anon, which tend to teach families how to keep themselves healthy and provide a support community for them, but it doesn't teach them how to engage. And that's what craft does. And so I know every family out there, what do you want most? You want your family member to be able to be healthy and thriving and get help. And craft teaches you how to engage with them in a way that makes that more likely. So on the family front, that would be the best option. And then on the policy front, how can we begin to move some of these drug markets back into regulated markets, whether that's starting with people who are already addicted, allowing them to access a quality controlled supply from a doctor under the care of a doctor. Now, I know people are immediately going to go, but what about Purdue Pharma? What about, prescriptions? So here's the option. We can have people using prescription drugs under the care of a doctor. The vast majority of doctors are wonderful people who are treating their patients with integrity.
Right. They want to do no harm.
Yes. Or we can send everyone to the underground market where there's no medical care. Nobody cares about what happens to them. They're getting completely free-for-all drugs. A baggie of something, a pill that's pressed with something. Those are the options. The option of just nobody's using anything is not the world that we live in. That's not an option. That is not on the table. The choice we have is how are they going to access the drugs that they're going to be using anyway? And we can educate against drug use. We've done it with tobacco very effectively. We didn't use criminalization for that. We didn't start arresting everyone who was smoking. We started educating people. We started changing social norms. We started incentivizing healthier behavior, like you get better insurance rates if you're not smoking, making it harder to find places to smoke where it's just kind of annoying now to have to find where am I going to go and smoke.
Right.
So we have
I was a child
that.
of the 90s when you could still smoke in like Applebee's. Like do you remember that smoking sections where you could just like walk over and like, but now, but as you're saying, like we've made it more, it's much harder to just like go about your life, and like you can't just be sitting in Applebee's now and light up.
Yep. So you're welcome to smoke, but there are lots of places where you can't smoke.
Right.
And that has been part of what has significantly decreased smoking over the last couple of decades. So we know there are ways to educate people that reduce the use of a highly addictive substance, but we can also make it where people who are going to use that substance are able to get a quality controlled amount and be able to be under the care of healthcare professionals, not drug dealers, while they are taking it. And we're able to move those markets back out of these underground markets that are creating so much havoc, particularly in developing countries where there is, it's much easier for cartels and terrorist organizations to buy off their elected officials, to basically run parts of the country or entire countries, basically. And where does the primary source of funding come for them? It comes from drug prohibition, from those underground drug markets.
Right.
So this idea that we are somehow fighting crime by cracking down on drugs is completely opposite. We are funding crime. We are incentivizing it. We are putting a massive pile of cash out there for anyone who will engage in crime to be able to get some of that money. It is the opposite of what people who want to live in safe communities should want.
Right.
That does not mean that it is comfortable. These are not comfortable ideas. There are no comfortable ideas when you talk about something like drugs that are potentially harmful.
Sure.
You have to weigh what is the least harmful way. And I'm convinced that it is approaching it through legally regulated markets, and through health-centered, family-centered approach to addiction.
So I'm wondering, have your feelings about drugs changed at all as like a recreational use of time? Like, I mean, do you think it's good to smoke weed, or, do you think those are good uses of someone's time? I
still have zero interest in recreational drug use. I I have never used marijuana. I've been to many states where it's legal, have zero interest in it. I don't like the smell. I don't, it is just not, it's not my thing. Now, I'm sure there's people who smoke weed that say it's not your thing because you've never tried it. If you would just try it, it would be your thing. I have no interest in trying it. I
Right.
don't, I almost never drink. I just don't have an interest in substance use in that way. And the more that I have learned about how we handle the pain in our lives, the more I um, am much more interested in finding healthy ways to
Right.
relax and healthy ways that don't. I do have a level of risk, even though I have had a lot of support and wonderful relationships and friendships in my life. I do still have a lot of risk factors for developing an addiction. I also have those resiliency factors that were given to me by other people who invested in me and gave me those gifts. So yeah, I still have no interest. I know for some people, kind of a shift in mindset is followed by this, hey, this isn't really a big deal.
Right.
Let's kind of be okay engaging in this. That has not been that way for me. And I, in my mind, I still think, what's the best way to not become addicted is just not to use it.
Right.
And I still feel that way. I don't think it is necessarily wrong to engage in recreational substance use. I think even as a Christian, we would have to look at scripture and say alcohol use was okay. Not becoming drunk, but using alcohol. Alcohol is a mind altering drug. It's a depressant. It's a poison that you're putting into your body. So there's certainly some lines there, but they're not quite as clear cut as maybe some of us were led to believe growing up. And we need to be careful not to be careful to approach substance use in a way that is honest to what it actually is, and not just kind of the moral overlay that we have grown up with.
So we've seen some places across the country decriminalize drugs, and the optics haven't been so great. You kind of alluded to this earlier in talking about, in your perfect picture, you would set some social norms. In preparing for this, I was reading a New York Times op-ed by the conservative columnist Bret Stephens, who was kind of outlining his objections to Oregon's drug decriminalization, which I think recently just recriminalized drugs. And he wrote about a woman who, quote, performed oral sex on a man at 11:30 in the morning on a block between Target and Nordstrom, and a police officer handing out toothless citations to addicts shooting up in public, sometimes on playgrounds. So I don't know you well, obviously, but I know enough about you to know that you're probably not down with, public sex and shooting up on playgrounds.
Yeah.
So can you talk about, in your kind of perfect vision for the world, what did these places just not really get, and what could they have done better?
Yeah, so I think there were some things that happened in Oregon that could have been done differently, and some things that were outside of their control. It just happened to all happen at the same time. So one of those was the emergence of fentanyl. Fentanyl hit the West Coast right about the same time that Oregon was decriminalizing drugs. So their overdose rate did shoot up after 2020, but it was if you look at the states around it, there was no difference in the rate that it went up versus other states that had not decriminalized possession of drugs. So in Oregon, they did not legalize drugs, so they were not legal markets, but it just was that people were not going to be arrested for drug possession anymore. So there was some backlash against that on the overdose side. Look what's happened. All these people are now dying of overdose because we decriminalized drugs. That is not true. There's no evidence that that's the case. It just happened to be that fentanyl arrived at the same time that drugs were decriminalized for possession. There also in Oregon was not a law or policy statute against public drug use. So police had used drug possession to police public drug use. That was just, if someone was using publicly, they could be arrested for possession instead of public use. And when they took away that ability to arrest people for possession, now there was nothing to arrest them for. The using in public was not something that they could could stop legally. And so you had a situation where even for most people who don't believe people should be arrested for possessing drugs, like me, we're not okay with people shooting up in front of the McDonald's or anything else like that. That's a separate thing than somebody just being.
And I
in
think that
possession of a
distinction
drug.
gets missed a lot in this conversation.
Yes, or we conflate drug possession with a host of other crimes, shoplifting, carjacking, whatever it might be. Those are separate, and that is it's not that they can't be related, but that's a separate crime. If you are arrested for shoplifting, that's a shoplifting charge. That's not a drug charge. And
whether you're drunk or high or sober or whatever.
Yes, exactly. And we have to be really careful not to swing that pendulum so far to say, hey, it's not just that we're going to not arrest people for possession. We're not going to arrest them for anything that they do related to their substance use. That is not in the best interest of that person or public safety or public policy, any of that. It's a different thing for someone to be in possession of a drug and for them to be engaging in harmful behavior against other people where there are other victims, where maybe it's public property, maybe it's private property that they're on. There are so many other issues that are wrapped up in that people often just wrap up all together. And it's understandable why they do that, because drugs have been an issue where we have not been encouraged to think in any kind of nuanced way about. We've just been encouraged to flatten everything out, lump it all together, and be afraid. And so we're using the tools we've been given when we respond in a way that just is a sort of blanket backlash. There are very real problems with what was happening in Oregon. I don't want to raise my kids in a place where there's just rampant public drug use everywhere. That's completely understandable. There are other ways to fix that other than criminalizing possession. Possession wasn't the problem that the public was upset about. It was all of the things that you were mentioning. And there are other ways to enforce those rules or to create rules that would give the police a way to police public drug use that would not go back to just possession.
100%. I think that a lot of people now conflate drug decriminalization with basically public spaces turning into shanty towns.
Yes.
And it doesn't have to be that way.
Yep.
So let's say we legalize drugs. Recreational consumption will almost certainly tick up for at least a time. I mean, I hear what you're saying about public education, and you're totally correct that cigarette smoking is not nearly as popular as it was in, say, the 70s, where people wanted to look like, greasers, and they thought smoking cigarettes looked cool. A lot of people, millennials, Gen Z, they don't think it looks cool anymore, which I agree is a success. But for at least a time, I think we would probably expect recreational consumption to go up, and I think you're seeing that with weed. Is that difficult for a lot of people in your more conservative circles, your more religious circles, to get over, and what is your response to it?
Yeah, I think so. It for me is the biggest kind of fear that I have related to that. It is, you're right, absolutely. I 100% believe that recreational use will increase. I'm not convinced that that is going to turn into an automatic increase in addiction rates, because addiction is driven by other things, not just exposure to a substance. And so if we want to deal with the other things that drive addiction, that's what's going to help us lower rates of addiction. And I think by moving drugs into legal markets, we're going to reduce the amount of trauma and suffering in people's lives. So that takes a few steps to get there. So think about people who live in communities where, like the community I grew up in West Jackson, gunshots every night while I'm laying in bed, police sirens every night.
Which is interesting because in the media you see like Jackson's not New York City. So I feel like it kind of flies under the radar that way. But you grew up in a very high crime area, correct?
Yeah. At least that was my experience, because why would you be hearing gunshots and police sirens all the time?
Well, I don't mean to, you have to laugh so you don't cry.
Something going on.
Right.
Yeah. And so So we experienced that. Now I look back on that and say, I wonder how much of that was actually driven by this underground market that was playing out on the streets of West Jackson all the time. People getting shot in drug busts that were going bad or whatever the case may be. So there's that level of trauma of unsafe communities that is exacerbated or created by this underground drug market. There are all of the families. Think about all of the families impacted by 100,000 people every year dying of a preventable overdose. The vast majority of those people are dying from contaminated drugs. This is not prescriptions that they're dying from. So all of those people have children, they have brothers and sisters, they have parents who are now dealing with, there's a whole bombshell of trauma that has exploded into this family, increasing everyone else's risk of developing problematic behaviors to deal with their trauma. So when I think of shifting markets legal, I think of it as a massive trauma reduction plan because of how much crime it's going to prevent, how many deaths it's going to prevent, how many people whose lives are torn apart and permanently sort of held back by criminal records, by family destabilization. All of this is trickling into every generation because every person, every adult we put in jail, most of them have children that are now impacted. And now their own risk of addiction is going up. Their own risk of experimenting with drugs is going up. We know this is the case. So if we want to break these cycles where we see so much harm and so much continued drug use through generations, we have to figure out how to reduce the amount of trauma and toxic stress that children are living in. And this is one way to do that. So will more people use? Yes. But I think we can address the reasons why they might become addicted, and that recreational use will not become addiction. And think about it like a bar graph with a bunch of different points of data on it. For most of us in America, when we think about drugs, we have one data point in our mind, and that's just drug use, rates of drug use, what you're talking about right now. So if that's all you have in your mind is the only thing that's at play, then if I tell you that rates of drug use are probably going to go up, then you immediately say, well, that's a bad policy. No policy works that way. Every policy impacts all sorts of areas of our lives.
What is the saying? There are only trade-offs.
Yes. So
There's
we
no
have
perfect
this
solution.
One of the things we're looking at is rates of drug use. And there's a whole host of other ones that are also part of that weighing of the pros and cons. And that includes, how safe do we want our communities to be? How much risk are we willing to take that our kids are going to die from an overdose just because they, use some pills at a party when they're in college? How much risk are we going to take that what's happening south of the border with countries that are particularly bearing the weight of this underground drug market, the impact that has on immigration here? There's all kinds of other trade-offs that we're making. And I think most of us have not realized that our lives are touched in almost every way by drug prohibition. It impacts we have woven the laws of drug prohibition into impacting just about everything. And once we begin to see that full graph built out, not just of rates of drug use, but all the other things, all the other costs and collateral damage that we have to live with because of this policy, to me, the weight became like 10 to 1 that these policies would overall decrease harm, even if we have a few more people that are using.
Right. So you make the argument in your book that prohibition historically is somewhat of a drug prohibition is somewhat of a new or somewhat of a recent response, well-intentioned, but in some sense a progressive response, and that legalization is actually the conservative response. And I was hoping you could talk through that. You talked a little bit about it earlier, but can you kind of walk us through the history of what this looked like before drug prohibition existed? Because I think a lot of people just kind of assume it was always this way.
Yeah, that included me. I thought it was always this way too. And as I started to learn, realized, wait a second, it wasn't that heroin is sort of naturally, its default is to be criminalized. The default was, hey, this is a substance that people use, and most people use it non-problematically, and some people use it problematically. And if they do, they need to be under the care of a doctor. That's how we handled it. So there's not a whole lot of things that I would say, let's go back 150 years and approach it the way we did 150 years ago. And in most things, we've made forward progress. This is one of the areas where we have made backwards progress. That has been a regression of
Right.
using something that we had actually a very effective approach to 100 years ago, where people who, let's take heroin, for instance, people could use heroin. It was available to people in the most popular forms were very low dose. You could buy it over the counter. It was in soothing syrups that moms like me used because life was hard and the kids were stressful, and they would go to their local pharmacy and get some soothing syrup to help them through the day. And people used it. Very few people became addicted to it, but some did, because we know that that is a risk
Right.
of using something that, even if it's a lower dose. If they became addicted to it, they could go to their doctor, and their doctor could, even if it was a higher dose, could prescribe them a regulated amount. They could take that under the care of their doctor. And at that time, people who struggled with addiction, very few of them were poor. Almost all of them were employed. They were still participating and able to be with their family in an engaged way, because so much of the harm that we experience now related to addiction is because at the point that someone begins struggling, for one, they're paying higher prices. So they begin to have a cash problem if they're struggling with an addiction. But we tend to cut them off from everything that helps them stabilize their life as soon as they start struggling. So they might lose their job if they fail a drug test. They might lose their family relationships. Now, maybe that's because of chaotic behavior. Maybe it's because of just family stigma, that we so misunderstand addiction that we suddenly think that, oh my gosh, I'm living with somebody who I don't even know, and they're not even trustworthy, and they're a bad person. That certainly plays into it. And so when we look at what has happened, we had this way of approaching it that was very health-centered. It was working. And then we made some shifts, largely related to, Dr. Bruce Alexander, the guy that ran the Rat Park experiment. He said, every now and then it's convenient to have a drug scare. And often what happens is we are afraid of something else, and drugs become a very easy thing to link it to. And so at the turn of the century, there was lots of fear over immigration, Chinese immigrants, African Americans having more rights, and drugs was an easy thing to link those to. And so we began to develop this fear of the drugs and this way of thinking about drugs that was so successful by the people who began the process of prohibition, that now you and me today, we don't even remember that this is the way the world
Right.
this is new. This is a very I would say got a big government. This is a very not conservative way of approaching substance use at all. It is very intrusive and invasive into the lives of people. And we have been okay with that because we have been led to believe that this is the only way. This is just the price we have to pay for a world where we're fighting drugs. And I think we're fighting them in the wrong way. We're not fighting them. We're funding them. We are making them far more deadly, far more harmful. And we can go back to a world where we focus on reducing harm from substance use and making sure that the markets have as little harm in them as possible. Alcohol causes more societal harm than any other drug. It's devastating. We're just
Right.
kind of used to those harms.
Well, yeah, we've just kind of accepted that that's just part of life,
Yes. Yep. And we know that it can be harmful. We also know that most people use it non-problematically. But we have mechanisms already. I think when people think about changing the way that we approach other drugs, they think, well, that would be crazy. That would be like a whole brand new thing. It's not a new thing. Alcohol is a legal drug that causes a lot of harm. And we have figured out ways to reduce the harms of alcohol while still allowing consumers to participate in it. We do not have the owner of one liquor store, going and taking out the owner of the liquor store across the street. Like, that just is a world that we can't even fathom. This sounds so crazy to us. That's exactly what we have under prohibition with other drugs. It's a choice that we've made. This is not a world we have to continue to live with. It's a world we've chosen to have, where we have this level of chaos surrounding substances. So we can go back. We can learn some lessons from the past, take some of that wisdom and bring it into the present, and let go of a really terrible experiment that has gone on, cost millions and millions of lives, and has been going now for so long that we've forgotten that there is a better way.
Right. We obviously live in a very politically binary world these days. Do you still consider yourself a Republican?
I think of myself as conservative because when I look at kind of policy approaches, I think I still believe in all of those policy approaches. So there are some things about kind of the Republican platform that they just feel kind of foreign to me. That's true of kind of both major platforms. I'm deeply committed to respectful dialogue. And it feels like most of the people out in the public today are not committed to that. So it's hard for me to identify there because it just is so counter to the way that I think it's helpful to engage in the world and to engage with people. But very much so. And Billy, it's interesting because as I was on this learning journey, I had this thought, particularly with my faith, but also with kind of the way that I view politics and the role of government, of, if I change my mind about this, does this mean I can't be a Christian anymore?
Right.
If I change my mind about this, does this mean like I'm not conservative anymore? And the more that I learned, the more I became convinced, and I'm still convinced, that no, my values have not changed. I have learned new information that has led me to believe that a different set of solutions is more in line with the values that I hold than the solutions I had been supporting. So I see it as just a learning journey of realizing I think we've lost our way on this.
Right.
And that would not be a surprising thing. Look at the history of the world. We've lost our way over and over and over again. And then we found it. And then, give us 25 years and we look back and go, oh my gosh, I can't believe people used to think X, Y, or Z.
Oh, absolutely. Right.
And yet the people at the time could not see that was not right. It was just the world, the air they breathed. So is it possible that suddenly we've entered into the utopia where there's nothing else that we're blind to? I think that would be incredibly foolish to think that's the world we live in. There are things we're blind to. I think this is one of them, and one that we're going to look back on in 25 years and say, wow, we got that so wrong, and I'm glad we moved past it.
Right. So when your organization, End It for Good, does a lot of discussion and on this issue, as you said, you're deeply committed to kind of having a civil conversation about this. Do a lot of people who kind of come from the same conservative roots, I mean, you're in Mississippi, a very conservative state, do they look at you like you're insane?
That's what I was worried about when I started talking about it. I thought, oh no, people are going to just be waiting for me to renounce my faith or say that I've, they think I've gone off the deep end. And what I found is that people are actually really interested. And part of it is, I think, because of my background, that it feels less threatening. They're not hearing this from someone who wants everyone to be out there smoking and using,
shooting it up or whatever. Right.
Yes, like that's not the angle at all. And so I think it gives them a sense of safety, that the kind of world that they want to see is the kind of world that I want to see, which is a world with less harm and also not a world where everyone's using drugs. So that, I was really worried about how people would respond, and have just been blown away at how much people actually long for solutions, at how much they are willing to be curious about those solutions if they can learn about them in a way that doesn't feel shaming and blaming, and are open to new ideas. Things, probably the most common thing I hear is, I've never thought about this before. So to be able to be part of someone's learning journey and
Right.
provide them with what was given to me, a place to learn, to ask questions,
Right.
not to be shamed and blamed, but
Right, because
just
you
to,
said at the beginning that's something you can really empathize with, right? Like you grew up just drugs bad, jail good.
yeah,
And I
yes,
think a lot of people come from that perspective, to be frank.
yeah. And I think the way that I thought about it was very much the way other people do, which is I'm not sitting here scheming, how can I destroy people's lives, or how can I
Right.
oppress people, or how can
Sure.
I, keep someone else from getting ahead. I do not maybe there's a few people out there who are thinking that. The vast majority genuinely, honestly believe that the way we're approaching drugs is just the best we've got.
Right.
And the fact that it doesn't work and we continue to get worse and worse outcomes is baffling. But
Right.
the only thing they hear is we just got to do it harder. So it's great to be able to give people a different way to think. And whether or not they end up agreeing with where we have landed, that's okay with us. We're willing to work with people. I went and led a book discussion on my book that came out last year at a local sheriff's department in North Mississippi. So the sheriff had come to one of our events and he reached out and said, I'd really like for all of my people to read your book, and will you come and lead a book discussion on it? So I went up and there was about 30, all of his deputies, all of his office staff, 30 people. They had lunch. We all had lunch together. And I gave kind of a presentation on the ideas of the book, and we went around. Everybody shared their thoughts and perspectives, and they ranged from this is crazy and could never work to one officer who's kind of sitting back against the wall, and he says, 25 years ago I knew that this whole war on drugs thing was not working, could not
That's
work.
fascinating.
So it's really interesting to see. Oftentimes, older we've done a lot of events with law enforcement, or have had law enforcement come to our events. And very often what you find is the longer people have been on the force, the more open they are to these ideas, because we had another event that was one of our events. We had about 120 people there, and there were two sheriffs there. Both of them stood up and publicly said, we've been in law enforcement for 40 years, and what we're doing isn't working. We arrest the same people over and over again,
Right.
and we're ready to make whatever changes the community wants to make. So that's here in Mississippi. These are conservative places, and people are open to change. And part of what we're doing is helping them understand the change that could help, and then allowing them to take that at their own pace. One community might say, hey, we could get behind, some small change. And we say, great. If all that comes from leading that book discussion with that sheriff's department, maybe there's not a policy change right now that community is open to, but maybe just the way that they police is different. Maybe their willingness to divert people into treatment instead of arresting them increases. Maybe the ability for them to give people a second or third chance instead of just going, straight to the felony
Right.
charge, that sort of thing. Those are huge changes that can affect people's lives really positively.
So I've covered a few cases of kind of like creative ways. I don't want to creative. I'm not trying to cast it in a positive light, but of I guess ways that governments are criminalizing drug use in ways that you might not expect. For instance, there was an Oklahoma woman not long ago named Brittany Pula, who was sentenced to 4 years in prison for manslaughter because prosecutors said her drug use led her to miscarry her 15 to 17 week old fetus, which was kind of fascinating because at the time that was in Oklahoma's legal abortion limit. So if she had gone to an abortion clinic, she would not have been arrested. And then, of course, there are also some cases I've covered where people will be arrested and prosecuted with facing extremely long prison terms for, quote, delivering drug delivery, because they pass the pipe to their friend and someone overdoses. What do you think about that? Do you think that is a pro-life approach? How do you kind of see that in the framework of this larger discussion?
Yeah, this is one of the so her instance in particular is one of my pet soapboxes, because I am a pro-life person, and so
Right.
I see these instances happening in conservative states in particular, where there are people in power and they say, we've got a lot of moms out there who are using drugs while they're pregnant. And how are we going to get them to stop doing that? And they go to the playbook that we have gone to for 50 years, which is let's punish them. And then they won't do that bad behavior anymore. So take that one step further and think about, what does that do to women that know that that's happening? They've heard about it happening to someone. So either they don't know it's happening, which means it doesn't deter them from anything.
Right, it's not going to be a deterrent if they don't know it.
Or they do know it's happening. What are they going to do? They're going to stay away from any kind of health care during their pregnancy. They're not going to go see a doctor. You're scaring them away from the very thing that their baby needs, which is to be under the care of a doctor. That is not a pro-life approach at all. So that would be kind of the best case scenario of what's going to happen. The worst case scenario is they think, I really want to have this baby, but I'm also, if I do, and I can't beat this addiction before I deliver, I'm facing 10 years in prison.
Right.
And I don't want my baby to be just lost in foster care while I'm gone. And so they go and have an abortion instead. That is the opposite of what we want to be encouraging for women who are pregnant. We want them to be drawn towards healthcare, towards all the things that can help them, not scaring them away from that or terrifying them into having an abortion that they might not even want. They might just be so afraid of what the outcome is going to be if they don't, that they feel like that is their only option. So these approaches that scare women, I know that the thought behind it is it's going to scare them out of doing the drugs. That's not how drug use and addiction work. People don't get scared out of it. But they can be drawn into support and helped through it so that they could deliver a healthy child under the care of a doctor.
Right. And then what do you think about those cases where people are prosecuted literally for delivering drugs because they are just it's not an exaggeration. I've covered a couple cases like this where, two people, let's say you're with your friend, you're shooting up in a bathroom, one of you overdoses, and then someone is prosecuted for drug delivery resulting in death, I think I might be misstating that a little bit, but that's the idea.
Yep. Because
they literally, and the delivery was like, I am passing you the drug. How does that, what do you think about that?
Yeah, those are really hard laws. And I think, again, that the thought behind that is, how do we, the only tool that we have used is just increasing punishment and penalty. So
longer sentences,
if there's any problem, that's what we tend to go to. Let's just what other kind of thing can we prosecute them with?
Right.
What other kind of penalty could we tack on to the one we already have? So think about, again, take it a step further. What's that doing? What it's doing is, if there are two people who are together and one of them overdoses, it's going to make the other one try to get out of there as fast as possible and not be connected to what might turn into somebody passing away. Because if they have read any of your reporting or anybody else's, that they know that this is a possibility. Sometimes these laws are called drug-induced homicide laws.
Right, exactly.
The last person it's basically a last touch of who was the friend that happened to be the one that got sent out to buy the drugs and brought them back for everyone at the party. That becomes the person, the dealer, the person who delivered those deadly drugs to.
Even though everyone did it of their own volition and free will.
Yes. And that person might have been, who knows? They take turns. That different person goes to buy the drugs every time. It may have been nothing of them actually being a dealer. But even if they are, what happens is, if you increase penalties on people who are at the scene, they're going to try to leave the scene. They're not going to call 911 and stick around, because what if their friend dies? Then they're going to be connected. And now they might be facing prosecution for murder. So instead of being drawn towards helping someone who's in a life-threatening health situation, we are pushing people away from helping. We're encouraging them to flee the scene. That is not what we want to do if we want to save lives. We need to be addressing this as a health crisis. If it's a potential overdose, we want to encourage people to be able to stay at the scene. And part of that is Good Samaritan laws. So some states have Good Samaritan laws where you will not be prosecuted if you call police. But a lot of times they're very narrow. So you won't be prosecuted if there's under a certain amount of drugs that are present at the scene. Now, you've got a room of inebriated people who are
Right.
high, who have who knows how much drugs other people might have,
Right.
what the police might find in the house. Nobody is going to be able to figure that out. That is completely detached from the real world. Or you have a situation where they'll say, we won't prosecute the person who calls, but everybody else who happened to be there is fair game. Well, again, who's going to call? Nobody is going to call and get their friends in trouble. So, with these laws are built on a figment of imagination about how drug use actually works in the real world, um, and they're built on the idea that we just have to find a way to punish someone when something terrible happens. Someone has to pay. I remember reading a piece about one of these laws that was passed, and they had talked to a prosecutor, and he said, when someone dies, the question I ask is who's going to pay.
Mm.
So for him, someone dies of an overdose, who's going to pay? He wants a person to prosecute for that, instead of saying this is a terrible tragedy and we've already lost one life. Instead, we're going to this place where we say, who else's life can we wrap up in this as well? That's a tragedy. That is a tragedy for families. It's not helpful. It increases the risk that people are going to die from overdose because they're afraid. And it takes this approach of a pound of flesh instead of looking at why are so many people dying of overdose. They're dying from contamination. This is preventable. We don't want thinking about alcohol. We don't want kids drinking underage. But if they want to, they'll find a way to do that. But they're drinking legally regulated alcohol. They're not getting some random something that somebody cooked up. They're still getting a regulated alcohol that they're getting diverted to the underground market. We don't want kids using other kinds of drugs. But today, there's nothing stopping them. There's no age restrictions. The guy selling heroin is willing to sell it to anybody who wants to
Right.
buy it. So at least we get some of those age restrictions and quality control by bringing those drugs legal again. Not a perfect world. We have to let go of that vision of we're going to find a perfect world where there are no drugs and no one is ever changing the way that they feel. That's not the world that we live in. But we can make some choices that would save a lot of lives, reduce a lot of crime, help families be able to be stable and get the help they need if they do have a loved one struggling with an addiction, in a world that I think is far more in line with American values, conservative values, Christian values, whatever values you have. Even if you have progressive values, there are sometimes that you come across policies that are just good for everyone.
Mm.
It's good for everyone that we're not flying down the interstate at 150 miles an hour. Sometimes there are things you can agree on, and that's not a loss. That's a win when you find places where everyone's values are upheld.
So recovering from addiction is obviously immensely difficult for a lot of people. And I think there's this idea that your life really can't be meaningful truly until you reach that finish line and, make it home and never relapse again. So if anyone, were to be listening to this who has struggled with addiction, whose family has struggled with addiction, what would you say to them about that idea that life really doesn't have meaning until you fully finished the course and are totally free?
I love that you brought this up because that is such a pervasive idea, and it is wrong. It is just wrong. We have approached addiction in America for the last 100 years, especially, as something for which there is only one cure. And that cure is sort of immediate, overnight abstinence for the rest of your life. And if you fail at that, it is your fault. You weren't committed enough to the process of maintaining that. And what we know from research is that if people can stay alive long enough, the vast majority of people will exit addiction on their own without treatment. That's mind-boggling because nobody's talking about that. The treatment centers certainly aren't talking about that. And most people just don't know that. But that is the truth. Most people who use drugs don't become addicted, and most people who become addicted recover on their own. Now, the challenge is, can they stay alive long enough in this age of fentanyl and nitazines and xylazine and the other things that are in our underground drug market? So that's one challenge. But the other is the mindset shift that I hope that we can make from, think about it like a staircase. If people are in chaotic active addiction, let's say they're on that bottom step, life is kind of just wild and crazy. And what they want is to be on that top step. They want to be living a thriving life where they're engaged and involved, or maybe right now they're just their family wants that for them. Maybe they don't want it for themselves yet. And this approach that we've taken has been to knock out all the steps in between and say, all right, you got to make this quantum leap, bottom step to top step. Basically overnight, you just make a decision one day and you make that leap. Very few people sustain that leap. Relapse rates for abstinence-only recovery, thinking something like AA, and I'm not totally against AA. I'm saying it is one tool, but it is a tool that works for very few people. Relapse rates are very high, 90%. That is not a system of recovery that we would say, well, then we don't need any other tools. This works for 10% of people. I think any of us would say, whoa, what about the other 90% for whom this is not working for them? This is not a good fit for them. Because it used to be that if you fell off that top step and you relapsed, that you went back to the bottom step and you tried again to make that quantum leap. For 100,000 people, that trying to take that quantum leap, for some of them, certainly not all of them were abstinent, but for a lot of people, if they are abstinent, your tolerance goes down and you don't know how much drugs you can use before you hit that amount which your body can't handle and you overdose. So now more and more people are trying to make that quantum leap. They're relapsing and dying in the process. And what would it look like if we could shift to building all of those steps back into that staircase? And we could first focus on, how can we keep you alive? Will you use fentanyl testing strips? Will you not use alone so there's someone to revive you? Will you make sure you always have Narcan with you and that the people who are with you know how to use it so that you could be revived if you're dealing with an overdose? That's just step one. How can you stay alive today? Now, step two might be whatever it is to that unique person's life. What's the next step that they're willing to take? Maybe it's that they're willing to try medication-assisted treatment. That is a form of addiction treatment that is shown to have higher rates of success and lower rates of death for opioid addiction than any other treatment that we know right now. But it's still highly stigmatized because people don't want to be taking some kind of medication, or their families don't think they should be. And so that could be another step. Could be another step to try to find housing. Could be another step to, visit your family once a month when you've had no relationship with them. Trying to begin to build back some of those stabilizing forces and supports in a person's life. Because if you think about your life as a glass that's full, people can't live with a glass that's empty. It's going to be full of something. And what we ask right now is for people to dump out what's filling their life. If they're in chaotic active addiction, there's probably a lot of unhealthy things that are filling their life. Drugs is one of those. Dump that all out and start with an empty cup and start trying to fill it up while they're already abstinent. Very few people can do that. What if instead we tried to begin helping fill their life with good things, with things that are healthier, things that are going to support recovery, that are going to help them either moderate or stop their use. People do moderate their use. That's a myth that no one is able to moderate their drug use. People slip in and out of addiction at various times in their life sometimes. During COVID, you see that happening. It's not that everyone who began drinking more during COVID is now an alcoholic.
Yeah.
A lot of people drank while they were lonely and isolated, and they stopped drinking so much when they were able to get back out again. So we have these steps that we can build back in. Can we do that for more people so that they're able to slowly make those changes over time? I know that families want people to make a change immediately. And for many people, they want to make a change immediately. But it's very unlikely that they're going to be able to sustain that change, because human behavior is such that it is very hard to change one behavior, much less a whole host of behaviors. Now, we can change, but we know that the most sustainable behaviors are ones that we build over time. They're not ones that we wake up and we say, you know what, I'm never eating chocolate cake again. Heck, I'm never eating sugar again for the rest of my life. How often is somebody able to do that? Basically never. But
can confirm. I tried.
Right. But can they make a choice to say, you know what, instead of dessert every night, I'm going to try to just do it 6 nights instead of 7. And let's see if I can make one change, and just then maybe another small change. So let's build back those steps into the staircase and provide people support and help to fill that cup up with good things before we ask them to dump out all of the things that are harmful. And for a lot of people, that allows them over time to make really healthy changes and to be able to sustain those changes, which is a really important part of recovery and of reducing the risk of death from a relapse.
Christina Dent, thank you for talking to Reason.
Thanks, Billy.